We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're going to be talking about something that I didn't think we would need to still be talking about, which is this Senate border bill that failed miserably in February, rightly so, but the administration and Democrats in Congress have latched onto it as a way of muddying the waters to make it seem like Republicans also don't want to fix what's happening at the border. In fact, by the time you hear this, there probably will have been another vote in the Senate to vote down the bill, but Senator Schumer planned to bring it up in order to use it as a cudgel against Republicans. It's not as though they're going to persuade voters that Democrats are serious about the border, but rather to muddy the waters and make it seem like the responsibility for the disaster at the border is shared. And, in so doing, hoping that it moves the needle a couple of points on an issue where the president has the most negative poll responses of any issue. In fact, last week in the New York Times, David Leonhardt, who is actually one of the more sensible people on his side of the aisle on the immigration issue and clearly criticizes the president having caused this disaster at the border, nonetheless has bought into the storyline that this so-called bipartisan bill, this is the one that Republican Senator Lankford was involved in, that it actually would have done something and that the Republicans, for political reasons, opposed it. Leonhardt said, for instance, quote, "The plan revolved around policies Republicans favor," unquote, and that voting it down was transparently cynical, in his words, and said that, quote, "Trump and his allies prioritized partisan gain," unquote. The thing is that when you actually look at what is in the bill, as we've discussed in earlier podcasts, it's just not true. And so we're going to have to do that again. And so to go over the details of the bill and why rejecting it wasn't just some partisan stunt, but was actually sound as a policy decision, we have with us in the studio Andrew Arthur, who is one of our star analysts and has delved into the guts of the Senate border bill, the Lankford bill. So we're going to go over, not in excruciating detail, but in some detail so that people understand what this bill would have done had it passed and why it really wasn't some kind of Republican wish list that they nonetheless rejected for political reasons. So, Art, thanks for joining us. So was this the toughest border security bill ever, as Senator Schumer has tried to, and the president have tried to say?
No, actually, and when I hear statements like that, I suffer from cognitive dissonance, the feeling that, I'm not actually 100% in line with reality and the way that the world actually works. I think that one of the biggest issues with this bill is its size. It's 280 pages. It's actually 370 all total. A lot of that is giving away the people's money. But the last 280 pages of the bill are actually the proposal itself. And it's mind-numbing stuff. It truly is. It's page after page of, we need a report on this and a report on that.
Right.
But the key provisions are actually, fairly distinct, but they're diffuse. So the bad that this bill does is actually spread throughout.
Oh, I see. Okay. So you have to actually be able to know what change clause A, B, C, X, Y, Z to and from of or whatever it is actually means.
Yes, and as a person who's actually drafted a number of bills in the past as a staffer on Capitol Hill for 8 years, I'm familiar with the tricks that you could play in order to hide things in bills, and whoever wrote this one was the master at whose feet I could learn. But let's just, talk about why this bill is necessary. It's beyond cavil. We all accept the fact that for the last 39 months, we've seen an unprecedented surge of migrants at the southwest border. Border Patrol apprehensions at that border soared from just over 400,000 in FY 2020, the year before President Biden took office, to more than 2.2 million in 2022. That's a 450% increase in 2 years. And those are just the people that were apprehended. We use a separate metric known as known gotaways, which is actually defined in statute if you ever see the word. And those are aliens who have evaded apprehension and entered the United States illegally. We saw them coming in, but Border Patrol agents couldn't catch them. Those rose from an average of just less than 150,000 in the whole 11-year period before President Biden took office to more than 670,000 in FY 2023. And those are the aliens that Chris Wray, the director of the FBI, said actually give him the most, concern. In fact, that was echoed by the Border Patrol chief who said, those are the ones who keep him up at night. We don't know anything at all about those
because
people.
They're the ones who aren't turning themselves in, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So the question is why we've seen this huge surge. And if you listen to the administration, they blame it on what they call root causes: poverty, corruption, crime, violence abroad, and climate change, food insecurity, various things like that. Those are all endemic issues with respect to the countries that these folks are coming from, and now they're coming from all over the world. But in a 2023 order, a federal judge named T. Kent Wetherell II issued a decision that blocked the Biden administration from paroling additional aliens into the United States. They can still release them, but they can't parole them. And what he found was that geopolitical factors like those, played some role, but the major role is that, quote, the administration has effectively incentivized what they call irregular migration by establishing policies and practices that all but guaranteed that the vast majority of aliens arriving at the southwest border who weren't excluded under the now defunct Title 42 would not be detained and would instead be allowed to be quickly released into the country, where they would go into asylum hearings that would take, 5 to 10 years to do. So Wetherell made it clear, and he had actually seen thousands of pages of evidence on this and heard over a year of testimony and briefing to reach that conclusion. So if you're going to stem this border crisis, you need to actually stop the administration's policy of releasing migrants. Right. It's also important to note that under current law, DHS is required to detain every migrant at the southwest border. Everybody who enters illegally and everybody who shows up at the ports of entry who doesn't have documents to enter into the United States is supposed to be detained. And it's because the administration, as Judge Wetherell found, has, ignored those mandates that there's a problem. And here's how the bill.
So basically, the short version of that is Biden caused this problem himself.
Biden is driving the border crisis, and probably more of the onus lies with DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, because he is the one who has actually implemented these release policies that plainly violate federal law. States have sued to stop them. Florida was successful in its case because it was very distinct. But in most of those cases, the courts have found that the states lack standing. It's just such a widespread problem that they can't show that it uniquely impacts them. So that's an important point. The bill addresses that in two ways. First, it codifies the very Biden release policies that Judge Wetherell found are driving this crisis. It creates an entirely separate system for adjudicating those asylum claims. And one of the things that you'll hear is it speeds the asylum claims. It does that by removing basically every protection that the current immigration court system has. I was an immigration judge, as you know, for 8 years. And, I heard a lot of border cases. And during those cases, there was a government attorney who could cross-examine the applicant, who could offer contrary evidence, who could impeach the testimony. And that's a key procedure that guarantees the due process rights of the American people.
Basically to limit the opportunities for fraud is kind of what
that's exactly what it does.
Yeah.
And to prevent the adjudicator from actually making an erroneous decision because they can appeal that decision. The government can appeal that decision if I made the wrong decision. And that happened to me. I was never overturned, but not on an asylum claim. But in any event, so it mandates the release of those people who claim asylum, provided that the secretary finds that operational circumstances require them to be sent into this separate proceeding before an asylum officer with no cross-examination, nobody impeaching the witness, and simply the witness's own testimony, unimpeached, being the only thing that the asylum officer can base the decision on. To be clear, Mark, it mandates the release of those individuals. It doesn't. And operational circumstances is the dodge that the Biden administration has used for the last 39 months to say it has to release all these people because, well, detention space is limited. But as analysis after analysis shows, the Biden administration isn't using the detention space that it has. So it's going to basically, it codifies that release policy.
So it would give the Homeland Security Secretary, give the administration the power to basically not quite rubber stamp asylum applications, but kind of, and would mandate the release of those people. So it would change the law to legalize the abuses that the administration is now engaging in.
That is exactly what it does in that regard. And it does one more important thing, Mark, in addition to sending it to this, quasi fake tribunal in which it's just an asylum officer making the decision. It also mandates that those individuals get employment authorization as soon as the asylum officer determines that they've passed the first very limited stage of review.
Right.
That limited stage of review is known as credible fear. Mm-hmm. Now, the bill also makes another change to the credible fear standard. Currently,
and it's advertised as toughening up that initial screening standard called credible fear.
Exactly. But what it really does is it simply swaps out one adjective for another. The current credible fear standard is a significant possibility that the alien is going to establish eligibility for asylum. Not a significant possibility that the alien is going to be subject to persecution on account of the 5 factors for relief: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. In place of that significant possibility, it changes it to reasonable possibility, which is actually a lower standard regardless of how you look at it.
Interesting.
Now, the way that they claim that this toughens up the standard is because there is a separate procedure called reasonable fear. That's for people who have already been deported from the United States, generally criminals who get deported from the United States and then re-enter. And they come in and they're like, well, no, I really need asylum this time. They don't get that lower credible fear standard. They have to satisfy a reasonable fear standard. That standard is a reasonable possibility that you're going to be persecuted on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. Basically, it's the same as the asylum standard. So the way that they've hidden this con that they're running is by using that reasonable adjective and substituting it for significant adjective. This is very arcane, but it's absolutely critical because it's also going to be up to Mayorkas to determine what a reasonable possibility is. So the same guy who is driving this border crisis is going to be the same guy who gets to decide. Finally, there's one other release mechanism that this bill includes. That's not the only one. The Biden administration for the last 39 months has also been releasing aliens apprehended at the border under a provision in the Immigration and Nationality Act that allows DHS to either detain or release an alien arrested on warrant. Aliens apprehended at the border aren't arrested on warrants because we don't know who's coming. We can't draft a warrant ahead of time. But the Biden administration has attempted to post hoc draft arrest warrants for aliens they want to release. And in fact, Judge Wetherell particularly criticized that interpretation. He didn't call it leisure domain, but he did more or less say, you call it a warrant of arrest, but it's really a warrant of release.
Okay.
So it amends that provision of the INA to, again, codify exactly what the Biden administration is doing. Now, keep in mind, this wasn't a Democratic bill. Jim Lankford of Oklahoma was the Republican who was in the room. I honestly don't think that Lankford knew what he was agreeing to in this regard, because if he had known that this would codify these release standards, he probably wouldn't have gone for it.
Yeah, I mean, before talking about some more of the bill, because I want to talk about this 5,000 threshold issue, what do you think happened in that room? Because this was negotiated by Republican Lankford. The Democrat senator was Murphy, right?
Chris Murphy of Connecticut.
Murphy in Connecticut. And then Kristen Sinema, who's really a Democrat but an independent, ostensibly, was the third person. As far as I know, none of them is a expert on immigration law, and I don't think their staff has real, deep knowledge in the way that, some staffs do on. So what happened here? I mean, it seems like somebody got pantsed. Somebody got taken here, and I think it was Senator Lankford.
Well, I agree with that assessment. There was a fourth person in the room that you haven't mentioned, and that is DHS.
Right.
I don't know whether Alejandro Mayorkas was actually physically there, but DHS also has a, huge cadre of individuals who like these policies, who like the release policies that they're engaging in. And I can assure you that, either Murphy or Sinema, possibly both, were being guided by outside groups who are very savvy in this. Now, again, Nobody came to me during these negotiations. Respectfully, I'm sort of recognized as an expert on this, and I've got 5 red line bills. I've actually passed legislation before, or gotten legislation passed. I don't want to aggrandize too much any more than I already have, but I think that this was a situation in which Lankford walked in good faith, and probably Sinema and Murphy walked in good faith. But, they ended up crafting something that very much is to the administration's taste, and the taste of an administration that has actually created the disaster that they're attempting to resolve. Right. I think it's been referred to as an arsonist being put in charge of the Forest Service. But yeah, I mean, that's more or less what you've got.
Right. So one of the provisions that actually got a lot of attention is this trigger mechanism where if illegal crossings reach a certain number of people in a day or an average over several days, the president would then be authorized to do something, which I think he already is authorized to do anyway. So if you could sort of briefly explain what was that mechanism and why is it not, the great border security tool that it's been billed as?
Very briefly, and this is a significant number of pages in the bill. If on a 7-day average, apprehensions reach 4,000, the president has optional authority to close the border to anybody else who's coming in. Now,
he has anyway, doesn't he? I mean,
he does. Section 212F actually gives the president the authority to do that. And the Supreme Court in Trump versus Hawaii found that provision exudes deference to the executive branch in every clause. But that's a different question.
Right.
So it would give him this optional authority. That optional authority would become mandatory if encounters on any given day reached 8,500, or there was a 7-day average of 5,000. Now, that sounds great on its face, but a couple of facts need to be considered. First, 5,000 people is 1.825 million people in a year. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a huge number.
And that's kind of setting that almost as a floor. Almost. Like this is the kind of acceptable, normal level of illegal immigration, and we will only do extraordinary things if it gets above 1.8 million illegal crossings in a year, which is crazy.
2, it also provides a trigger for the president to waive that. 3, it includes exceptions for people, who have asylum claims. Now, again, it's the abuse of the asylum system that's such an issue. But, the most important part is that it also has limits on the number of days the president can use it, and it sunsets after 3 years.
So Trump can't use it.
Trump can't use this authority. So, yeah, I mean, there are so many flaws and dodges in this, but really the crucial point to note is the one that you just made about the floor. It sets 5,000 a day as a floor. By the way, it also provides that even when that border shutdown is in effect, Mayorkas still has to allow 1,400 people to apply for asylum at the ports.
Has to. He's required to.
He's required to. 511,000 people per year by my somewhat faulty math. But the question becomes, what if 1,400 people don't show up at the port? What is Mayorkas supposed to do? Is we supposed to send people to Mexico to encourage them to come in? But when you talk about 5,000 people a day, consider the fact, Mark, that between FY 2017 and FY 2019, I'm going to toss out the COVID year of, FY 2020, which is sort of a wild card. agents apprehended on average 1,354 migrants per day, 27% of that vaunted 5,000 person limit. So yeah, this really accepts failure at the border. It accepts the fact that we're never going to get security. And a lot of people quote a statement that former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson, who actually was, fairly effective, he made in 2017, where he said, I would get the daily numbers, and if they were 1,000 or lower, I knew things were fine. But if they were over 1,000, I was going to have a very bad day, which is a direct quote. When you're talking about 5 times a very bad day, that is the life. It's sort of the hell that it's consigning Border Patrol agents to at the southwest border, that they're just going to be overwhelmed and Congress doesn't care.
So basically, this bill codifies failure at the border is kind of what it amounts to, because it seems like this is an ideal bill for the Biden administration or for Secretary Mayorkas. In other words, what would they have come up with if not this? In other words, if you had something that they were writing from scratch, obviously there's all kinds of other things they would want. But if the administration from scratch were writing something that they would be able to say was politically useful for the administration in his reelection campaign, this kind of is that bill. This is not some Republican wish list. It's actually almost kind of a Democratic wish list.
It's Joe Biden and Alejandro Mayorkas' wish list. This is, this literally puts into law everything that they've been doing and everything that they've been doing that violates the mandates in the INA. Now, that leads to a very important point, Mark, and that is a future administration, whether it's Donald Trump in 2025 or some other person later on, or even the Biden administration. If something happens, if there's a terrorist attack and they want to crack down at the border, they actually need to have the tools to do that. Again, the current INA allows the president to shut down the border. That's crucial to understand.
Right.
The current INA contains mandates that prevent a disaster like the one that's going on right now from occurring. You just have to follow the rules to do that. But there was a case back in 2019 or 2020 called Jennings versus Rodriguez. And that was a case that involved Mr. Rodriguez, who was an alien apprehended at the border and detained by DHS. And DHS didn't want to release him because they were mandated to detain him. The Ninth Circuit said, no, you have to give him a bond hearing, you got to give him a chance, and you got to let him go. The Supreme Court stepped in that case and said, no, the current INA mandates detention. We can't second guess what Congress did. If this bill were to go into effect, Donald Trump would not be able to secure the border because every person who was detained would go to a federal district court and file what's called a habeas corpus, saying, I must be released. And district courts are going to left and right say, look at this language in the INA. Detention isn't mandatory. You have to release them.
Interesting. So not only is this Senate bill kind of, in a sense, a sort of re-election platform for the president in some sense. As far as his political goals, but it's also kind of a time bomb for future administrations, as you pointed out. So that's actually kind of interesting, because I hadn't really thought of it that way, because as you mentioned, there are these sunset provisions to kind of deny President Trump, if he is reelected, or some future president, a use of some of these powers. So in other words, it really is just almost the statute itself in some ways is explicitly designed as a campaign document, because, they want to sort of get over the hump of the next election. And then a lot of these things after another year or so will turn into pumpkins. But it also has buried in it long-term consequences for future presidents.
Yeah, no, it contains a poison pill. This bill is a win-win for the Biden administration and for Alejandro Mayorkas. Keep in mind, Mark, that at the same time they were drafting this in the Senate, the House was impeaching Mayorkas for exactly what this bill codifies.
Yeah.
But, that's Capitol Hill for you, but that's a different issue. But yeah, if this bill were to ever take effect, it would be impossible for President Trump, President DeSantis, President Kennedy, or President Haley to ever actually secure the border again. And it would lead to some very dangerous consequences. Bad people would be able to get into the United States. Border Patrol agents would be overwhelmed. The number of gotaways would probably reach 1 million a year. So, yeah, I mean, yes, it's a win-win for the administration and basically a lose-lose for congressional Republicans and many, reasonable Democrats. Because if this bill were to take effect, it would be impossible to secure the border. But if it doesn't take effect, then Majority Leader Chuck Schumer sends out a tweet a day about how the Republicans haven't acted on this bill. The problem is, Mark, nobody's actually read the bill who talks about it.
Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about briefly is to sort of counter this idea that the Republicans are totally cynical on this and they just sort of want the border to remain bad until November to help with the election. Because the Republican majority in the House has actually passed border security legislation that has a lot of measures in it, and they would be happy to see that pass. And if you could just, the shorthand, I mean, the number for that is H.R. 2, and that's usually the way it's discussed. It was introduced in the Senate. In fact, I think Senator Cruz last week introduced it for, unanimous consent as sort of one of the means, and the Democrats said no, obviously. But the point is, there are competing proposals for border security. This isn't just a matter of there being one bill, Republicans holding their breaths until they turn blue kind of, and not going along with it. There's actually a Republican proposal for border security. Why aren't the Democrats passing that in the Senate?
Because they don't want to. To actually pass H.R. 2 would be a way of admitting the fact that what's going on at the southwest border isn't a function of those geopolitical factors, all of that climate change and everything else, that people are coming because they're rational economic actors. They respond to incentives. 1, 2, the White House opposes H.R. 2. The whole purpose of H.R. 2 is to tie the president's hands. Again, there are already mandates. Biden's ignoring those mandates.
Right.
What this would do is take away any opportunity that he would have not to comply with those mandates.
Right. And so, in a sense, if you, to kind of conceptualize what the two pieces of legislation do, the Democratic-supported Lankford bill, supposedly the bipartisan Senate bill, although I wouldn't be surprised if Senator Lankford himself kind of distances himself from the bill, but that seeks to manage mass illegal immigration across the border. Whereas H.R. 2, the one supported by Republicans, would actually seek to limit and ideally end illegal immigration. And that does, I think, distill the approaches of the two parties on this issue. Democrats are okay with mass immigration beyond the limits set in law. They just want to manage it better. Republicans want to not have mass illegal immigration. They want to stop it, not manage it.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. But it's also important to note that there are, moderate Democrats, especially ones who are in tight races, who actually want to see improvement. In fact, there was a resolution that was passed by the House in January. It only has to be passed by one body. It doesn't have any effect. That blamed the Biden administration for its open borders policies. 14 Democrats actually signed on with the Republicans on this bill.
Out of 200 plus.
Out of 200 plus. So, this is an electoral difficulty for them. But again, there are Democrats who recognize the problems at the border, who recognize the dangers that this has for the United States. But you actually make a very interesting point about H.R. 2. People are like, oh, this is a non-starter. It's a non-starter. I was on Capitol Hill on September 11th. I was on Capitol Hill on September 10th, 2001. And a lot of ideas that were impossible on September the 10th, 2001, suddenly became the conventional wisdom on September the 11th, 2001, and especially the 12th. I mean, I can remember emails flying around at 8 o'clock in the morning on the 12th, proposals for things we needed to do. We don't want to get to that point. We want to stem this right now. We already see some high-profile crimes that are committed by aliens who have, crossed the border. We had a recent incursion, which hadn't been discussed very much, at Quantico Marine Corps Base,
right,
in which Jordanian, who Griff Jenkins has recently tweeted out from Fox News, That individual had crossed the border in April, somehow ended up in a box truck in the middle of the night at the main gate at Quantico Marine Base on a Friday morning.
As one does.
As one does. So, yeah, I mean, you know, the whole system is blinking red right now. And it's time for us to have not political debates or, you know, a counting coup, but for statesmen and stateswomen to stand up and actually do the right thing.
Yeah, so let's hope it doesn't take some replay of 9/11 or something worse to get movement on this issue. Hopefully not, but either way, if it does or doesn't, we'll probably have you back, Art, to talk more about this issue. And I think the administration is kind of out of ideas, so they're going to keep talking about this bill from now till November, almost certainly, even though it's not going anywhere. It's all they have. And so this, in a sense, our discussion today is kind of an evergreen. Maybe in the doldrums of summer, if we have nothing to do, we may rerun it because it'll just be as relevant then, I think, given the nature of the way the administration is talking about the border issue as it is now. So thanks for coming in, and hopefully we'll have you back.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
So until next time, this is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies. If you liked Parsing Immigration Policy and aren't subscribed yet, subscribe at all the usual podcast places. Give us a like or a rating or whatever your podcast platform permits. And if you have any complaints or compliments or suggestions for future shows or any other kind of comments, feel free to email us at center@cis.org. And I hope you tune in next week.